everyone, welcome back to Reads with Rune B. Today we are continuing with our secondary read, Oliver Twist. We are doing chapters 12 and 13 today, isn't that right?
Yep.
And we are joined by my partner in crime, Rob!
Hello!
So, without further ado, let's continue our story. Chapter 12, in which Oliver is taken better care of than he ever was before, and in which the narrative reverts to the merry old gentleman and his youthful friends. The coach rattled away down Mount Pleasant and up Exmouth Street over nearly the same ground that Oliver had traversed when he first entered London in the company with the Dodger, and turning a different way when it reached the Angel of Islington, stopped at length before a neat house in a quiet, shady street near Pentonville. Here a bed was prepared without any loss of time, in which Mr. Brownlow saw his young charge carefully and comfortably deposited, and here he was tended to with kindness and solicitude that knew no bounds.
But for many days Oliver remained insensible to all the goodness of his new friends. The sun rose and sank and rose and sank again, and many times after that, and still the boy lay stretched on his uneasy bed, dwindling away beneath the dry and wasted heat of fever. The worm does not his work more surely on the dead body than does this slow creeping fire upon the living frame.
Weak and thin and pallid, he awoke at last from what seemed to have been a long and troubled dream, feebly raising himself in the bed. With his head resting on a trembling arm, he looked around anxiously.
What room is this? Where have I been brought to?
Said Oliver.
This is not the place I went to sleep in.
He uttered these words in a feeble voice, being very faint and weak. But they were overheard at once, for the curtain at the bed's head was hastily drawn back, and a motherly old lady, very neatly and precisely dressed, rose and withdrew it from an armchair close by, which she had been sitting in at needlework.
Hush, my dear,
said the old lady softly.
You must be very quiet, or you will be ill again, and you have been very bad as bad could be, pretty nigh. Lie down again, there's a dear.
With these words, the old lady very gently placed Oliver's head upon the pillow, smoothing back his hair from his forehead, looked so kindly and lovingly in his face that he could not help but placing his little withered hand in hers and drawing it around his neck.
Save us,
said the old lady, with tears in her eyes.
What a grateful little dear it is, pretty creature. What would his mother feel if she had sat by him as I have, and could see him now?
Perhaps she does see me, whispered
Oliver, folding his hands together.
Perhaps she has sat by me. I almost feel as if she had.
That was the fever, my dear, said
the old lady mildly.
I suppose it was,
replied Oliver,
because heaven is a long way off, and they are too happy there to come down to the bedside of a poor boy. But if she knew I was ill, she must have pitied me even therefore, for she was very ill herself before she died. She can't know anything about me, though, added Oliver after a moment's silence. If she had seen me hurt, it would have made her sorrowful, and her face has always looked sweet and happy when I have dreamed of her. The old lady made no reply to this, but wiping her eyes first, and her spectacles, which lay on the counterpane afterward, as if they were a part and parcel of those features, brought some cool stuff for Oliver to drink, and then, patting him on the cheek, told him to lie very quiet, or he would be ill again. So Oliver kept very still, partly because he was anxious to obey the kind old lady in all things, partly to tell the truth, because he was completely exhausted with what he had already said. He soon fell into a gentle doze, from which he was awakened by the light of a candle, which being brought near the bed showed him a gentleman with a very large and loud gold clock, watch in his hand, who felt his pulse and said he was a great deal better.
"You are a great deal better, are you not, my dear?"
said the gentleman.
"Yes, thank you, sir."
replied Oliver.
"Yes, I know you are,"
said the gentleman.
"You're hungry too, aren't you?"
"No, sir."
answered Oliver.
Said
the gentleman.
"No, I know you're not. He is not hungry, Mrs. Bedwin,"
said the gentleman, looking very wise. The old lady made a respectful inclination of the head, which seemed to say she thought the doctor was a very clever man, and the doctor appeared very much of the same opinion himself.
"You feel sleepy, don't you, my dear?"
said the doctor.
"No, sir."
replied Oliver.
"No?"
said the doctor, with a very shrewd and satisfied look.
"You're not sleepy, and not thirsty, are you?"
"Yes, sir, rather thirsty,"
answered Oliver.
"Just as I expected, Mrs. Bedwin,"
said the doctor.
"It's very natural that he should be thirsty. You may give him a little tea, ma'am, and some dry toast without any butter. Don't keep him too warm, ma'am, but be careful that you don't let him get too cold. Will you have the goodness?"
The old lady dropped a courtesy. The doctor, after tasting the cold stuff and expressing a qualified approval, therefore hurried away, his boots creaking in a very important and wealthy manner as he went downstairs. Oliver dozed off again as soon as this, and when he awoke it was nearly 12 o'clock. The old lady tenderly bade him good night shortly afterwards, and left him in charge of a fat old woman who had just come, bringing with her a little bundle, a small prayer book, and a large nightcap. Putting the latter on her head and former on the table, the old woman, after telling Oliver that she had come to sit up with him, drew her chair close to the fire and went off in a series of short naps, checkered at frequent intervals with sundry tremblings forward and driver moans and choking, which, however, had no worse effect than causing her to rub her nose very hard and then fall asleep again.
And thus the night crept slowly on. Oliver lay awake for some time, counting the little circles of light which the reflection of the rushlight shade threw upon the ceiling, or tracing with his languid eyes the intricate pattern of the paper on the wall. The darkness and the deep stillness of the room were very solemn, and as they brought into the boy's mind the thought that death had been hovering there for many nights and days, and might yet fill it with the gloom and dread of his awful presence, he turned his face upon the pillow and fervently prayed to heaven.
Gradually he fell into a deep tranquil sleep, which, eased from recent suffering, alone imparts the calm and peaceful rest which it is pain to wake from, who, if there were death, would be roused again to all the struggles and turmoils of life, to all its cares for the present, its anxieties for the future, more than all its weary recollections of the past. It had been a bright day for hours when Oliver opened his eyes, and when he did so he felt cheerful and happy. The crisis of the disease was safely past. He belonged to the world again.
In 3 days' time he was able to sit in an easy-chair, well propped up with pillows. As he was still too weak to walk, Miss Bedwin had him carried downstairs into the little housekeeper's room, which belonged to her, where, having sat him by the fireside, the good old lady herself sat down too, and being in a state of considerable delight, seeing him so much better, began to cry forthwith most violently.
"Never mind me, dear,"
said the old lady.
"I'm only having a regular good cry. It is all over now. I'm quite comfortable."
"You're very, very kind to me, ma'am,"
said Oliver.
"Well, never mind that, my dear,"
said the old lady.
"That's got nothing to do with your broth, and it's full time you had it. For the doctor says Mr. Brownlow may come in and see you this morning, and we must get up our best looks, because the better we look, the more he'll be pleased."
And with this, the old lady applied herself to warming up in a little saucepan a basin of broth, strong enough to furnish an ample dinner when reduced to the regulation strength for 350 paupers at the very lowest computation.
Are you fond of pictures, my dear?
Inquired the old lady, seeing that Oliver had fixed his eyes most intently on a portrait which hung against the wall just opposite his chair.
I don't quite know, ma'am,
said Oliver, without taking his eyes off the canvas.
I have seen so few I hardly know. What a beautiful, mild face that lady's is.
Ah,
said the old lady.
Painters always make ladies out prettier than they are, or they wouldn't get any custom, child. The man that invented the machine for taking likeness might have known that would never succeed. It's a deal, to be honest. A deal.
It's a deal too honest.
Yeah, a deal, said the old lady, laughing very heartily at her own acuteness.
Is that a likeness, ma'am?
Said Oliver.
Yes,
said the old lady, looking up for a moment from the broth.
That's a portrait.
Whose, ma'am?
Asked Oliver eagerly.
Why, really, my dear, I don't know,
answered the old lady in a very good-humoured manner.
It's not the likeness of anybody that you or I know, I expect. It seems to strike your fancy, dear.
It's very pretty,
replied Oliver.
Why, are you sure you're not afraid of it?
said the old lady, observing in great surprise the look of awe with which the child regarded the painting.
Oh, no,
returned Oliver quickly.
But the eyes look so sorrowful, and where I sit I see them fixed upon me. It makes my heart beat,
added Oliver in a low voice,
as if it was alive and wanted to speak to me, but couldn't.
Lord save us,
exclaimed the old lady, startling.
Don't talk in that way, child. You're weak and nervous after your illness. Let me wheel your chair around to the other side, and then you won't see it. There,
said the old lady,
suiting the action to the words.
Now you don't see it at all events. And here is Oliver and the old lady in her room. She's fixing him the broth.
Oliver, did you see it in his mind's eye, distinctly, as if he had not altered his position? But his thought is better not to worry the kind old lady, so he smiled gently, and when he looked at him, and Mrs. Bedwin, satisfied that he felt more comfortable, salted and broke bits of toasted bread into the broth with all the bustle befitting so solemn a preparation. Oliver got through it with extraordinary expedition, and had scarcely swallowed the last spoonful when there came a soft tap at the door. Come in,
said the old lady, and in walked Mr. Brownlow. Now, the old gentleman came in as brisk as need be. He had no sooner raised his spectacles to his forehead and thrust out his hand behind the skirts of his dressing gown to take a good long look at Oliver, than his countenance underwent a great variety of odd contortions. Oliver looked very worn and shadowy from the sickness, and made an ineffectual attempt to stand up out of respect to his benefactor, which terminated in him sinking back into the chair again. And the fact is, if the truth must be told, that Mr. Brownlow's heart, being large enough for any six ordinary old gentlemen of humane disposition, forced a supply of tears into his eye by some hydraulic press, which we are not sufficiently philosophical to be conditioned to explain.
Poor boy,
said Mr. Brownlow, clearing his throat.
I'm rather hoarse this morning, Mrs. Bedwin. I'm afraid I have caught a cold.
I hope not, sir,
said Mrs. Bedwin.
I've done everything everything you've had has been well aired, sir.
I don't know, Bedwin. I don't know,
said Mr. Brownlow.
I'd rather think I had a damp napkin at dinner time yesterday, but never mind that. How do you feel, my dear?
Very happy, sir,
replied Oliver.
And very grateful indeed, sir, for your goodness to me.
Good boy.
said Mr. Brownlow stoutly.
Have you given him any nourishment, Bedwin? Any slops, eh?
He has just had a basin full of beautiful strong broth, sir,
replied Mrs. Bedwin, drawing herself up a slightly and layering a strong emphasis on the last word to intimate that between slops and broth well compounded that existed no affinity or connection whatsoever.
Ugh,
said Mr. Brownlow with a slight shudder.
A couple of glasses of port wine would have done him a great deal more good, wouldn't they, Tom White, eh?
My name is Oliver, sir,
replied the little invalid, with a look of great astonishment.
Oliver?
said Mr. Brownlow.
Oliver what? Oliver White, eh?
No, sir. Twist. Oliver Twist.
A queer name,
said the old gentleman.
What made you tell the miscreant your name was White?
I never told him so, sir,
returned Oliver in amazement.
This sounded like a falsehood. This sounded so like a falsehood that the old gentleman looked somewhat sternly in Oliver's face. It was impossible to doubt him. There was truth in every one of its thin and sharpened lineaments. Some mistake,
said Mr. Brownlow, but although his motivation for looking steadily at Oliver no longer existed, the old idea for the resemblance between his features and some familiar face came upon him so strong that he could not withdraw his gaze.
I hope you're not angry with me, sir,
said Oliver, raising his eyes beseechingly.
No, no,
replied the old gentleman.
Why, what's this, Bedwin? Look here.
As he spoke, he pointed hastily to the picture above Oliver's head, and then to the boy's face. There was a living copy. The eyes, the head, the mouth, every feature was the same. The expression was for the instant so preciously alike, precisely alike, that the minutest line seemed copied with a startling accuracy.
Oliver knew not the cause of this sudden exclamation, for not being strong enough to bear the start it gave him, he fainted away, a weakness on his part which affords the narrative the opportunity of relieving the reader from the suspense on behalf of the two young pupils of the merry old gentleman and of the recording.
That when the Dodger and his accomplished friend Master Bates joined in the hue and cry which was raised at Oliver's heels in consequence of their executing an illegal conveyance of Mr. Brownlow's personal property, as he had already described that they were acquitted by a very laudable and becoming regard for themselves, and for as much as the freedom of the subject and the liberty of the individual are among the first and proudest boasts of a true-hearted Englishman, so I need hardly beg the reader to observe that the action should tend to exalt them in the opinion of all public and patriotic men, in almost a great degree of this strong proof of their anxiety for their own preservation and safety goes to corroborate and confirm the little code of law which certain profound and sound judging philosophers have laid down as the mainsprings of all nature's deeds and actions, the said philosophers very wisely reducing the good lady's proceedings to matters of maximum and theory, and by the very neat and pretty compliment to her exalted wisdom and understanding, putting entirely out of sight any considerations for heart or generous impulse and feelings, for these are matters totally beneath a female who is acknowledged by universal admission to be far above the numerous little foibles and weaknesses of her sex.
If I wanted further proof of the strictly philosophical nature of the conduct of these two young gentlemen and their delicate predicament, I should at once find it in the fact, also recorded in the foregoing part of this narrative, of their quitting the prison when the general attention was fixed upon Oliver and making immediately for their home by the shortest possible cut. For although I do not mean to assert that it is the usual practice of renowned and learned sages to shorten the road to any great conclusion, their course indeed being rather lengthened by the distance by various circumlocutions and discursive staggerings unto those like drunken men, under the pressure of a too mighty flow of ideas, and prone to indulge, I mean to say, and I do say distinctly, that the invariable practice of many mighty philosophers in carrying out their theories to evience great wisdom and foresight in providing against every possible contingency which can possibly be supposed at all likely to affect themselves. Thus to do a great right, you may do a very little wrong, and you may take any means which in the end will be attained but will justify itself. The amount of right or the amount of wrong, indeed the distinction between the two, being entirely left to the philosopher concerned, to be settled and determined by his clear, comprehensive, and imperative view of his own particular case.
It was not until the two boys had scoured with great rapidity through a most intricate maze of narrow streets and courts that they had ventured to halt by one concert beneath a low and dark archway. Having remained silent here just long enough to recover breath to speak, Master Bates uttered an exclamation of amusement and delight, and bursting into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, flung himself upon the doorstep and rolled thereon in a transport of mirth.
"What's the matter?"
inquired the Dodger.
"Ha ha ha ha!"
roared Charlie Bates.
"Hold your noise,"
remonstrated the Dodger, looking cautiously around.
"Do you want to be grabbed, stupid?"
"It can't be helped,"
said Charlie.
"I can't help it. To see him spluttering away at that pace, and cutting round the corners, and knocking up against the post, and starting on again as if he was made of iron as well as them, and me with the wiping in my pocket stinging out arters him. Oh, my eyes!"
The vivid imagination of Master Bates presents the scene before him in too strong colours. As he arrived at this apostrophe, he again rolled upon the doorstep and laughed louder than before.
What'll Fagin say?"
inquired the Dodger, taking advantage of the next interval of breathlessness upon the part of his friend to propound the question.
"What?"
repeated Charlie Bates.
What?"
said Dodger.
"Why, what should he say?"
inquired Charlie, stopping rather suddenly in his merriment, for Dodger's manner was impressive.
"What should he say?"
Mr. Dawkins whistled for a couple of minutes, and then taking off his hat, scratched his head and nodded thrice.
What do you mean, said
Charlie.
"Tooraloo, gammon and spinach, the frog he wouldn't, and the high cockalorum,"
said the Dodger, with a silent sneer on his intellectual countenance.
This was explanatory, but not satisfactory. Master Bates felt it so, and again said,
"What do you mean?"
The Dodger made no reply, but putting his hat on again, and gathering the skirts of his long-tailed coat under his arm, thrusted his tongue into a cheek and slapped the bridge of his nose some half-dozen times in a familiar but expressive manner, and turned on his heels, slunk down the court. Master Bates followed with a thoughtful countenance. The noise of footsteps in the creaking stairs a few minutes after the occurrence of the conversation aroused the merry old gentleman as he sat over the fire with a saveloy and a small loaf in his left hand, a pocket knife in his right, and a pewter pot in the trivet. There was a rascally smile on his white face as he turned round and looked sharply out from under his thick red eyebrows, bent his ear towards the door, and listened intently.
"Why, how's this?"
muttered the Jew, changing countenance.
"Only two of them. Where's the third? They can't have gotten into trouble, hark."
The footsteps approached, neared. They reached the landing. The door slowly opened, and the Dodger and Charlie Bates entered, closing it behind them.
Chapter 13. Some new acquaintances are introduced to the intelligent reader, connected with whom various pleasant matters are related appertaining to this history.
"Where's Oliver?"
said the Jew, furious, with a menacing look.
"Where's the boy?"
The two young thieves eyed their preceptor as if they were alarmed at his violence, and looked uneasily at each other, but they made no reply.
"What's become of the boy?"
said the Jew, seizing the Dodger tightly by the collar and threatening him with horrid imprecations.
"Speak out, or I'll throttle you."
Mr. Fagin looked so very much in earnest that Charlie Bates, who deemed it prudent in all cases to be on the safe side, and who convinced it by no means improbable that there might well be his turn to be throttled the second, dropped upon his knees and raised a loud, well-sustained, and continuous roar, something between a mad bull and a speaking trumpet.
"Will you speak?"
thundered the Jew, shaking the Dodger so much that keeping his big coat on at all seemed perfectly miraculous.
"Why, the trap have got him, and that's all about it,"
said the Dodger sullenly.
"Come, let go of me, will you?"
And swinging himself at one jerk clean out of the big coat which he left in the Jew's hands, the Dodger snatched up the toasting fork and made a pass at the old merry gentleman's waistcoat, which, if it had taken effect, would have let a little more merriment out than could have been easily replaced in a month or two.
The Jew stepped back in this emergency with more agility than could have been anticipated for a man of his apparent decrepitude, and seized up the pot, prepared to hurl it at his assailant's head. But Charlie Bates at this moment called his attention by a terrific howl. He suddenly altered its destination and flung it full at the young gentleman.
"Why the blazes is this in the wind now?"
growled a deep voice.
"Who pitched this 'ere at me? It's the beer and not the pot, as it had hit me, or I'd have settled somebody. I might have known as nobody but as an infernal rich, plundering, thundering old Jew could afford to throw away any drink but water, and not that unless he done the river company every quarter. What's it all about, Fagin? Damn me if my neckerchief ain't soaked with beer. Come in, you sneaking varmint. What you stopping outside for, as if you were ashamed of your master? Come in!"
The man who growled out at these words was a stoutly built fellow of about 35, in black velveteen coat, very short drab breeches, laced up half boots, and grey cotton stockings, which enclosed a very bulky pair of legs, with large swelling calves. The kind of legs that in such costume always looked in an unfinished and incomplete state without a set of fetters to garnish them. He had a brown hat on his head and a dirty bleacher handkerchief round his neck, with the long frayed end of which he smeared the beer from his face as he spoke, disclosed, when he had done so, a broad heavy countenance with a beard of 3 days' growth, and scowling eyes, on one of which displayed various particular-coloured symptoms of having been recently damaged by a blow.
"Come in, d'ye hear?"
growled the engaging ruffian.
A white, shaggy dog, with his face scratched and torn 20 different places, sulked into the room.
"Why didn't you come in afore?"
said the man.
"You're getting too proud to own me a 4 company, are you? Lie down."
This command was accompanied with a kick which sent the animal to the other end of the room. He appeared well used to it, however, for he coiled himself up in a corner very quietly, without uttering a sound, and winking his very ill-looking eyes about 20 times a moment, appeared to occupy himself in taking survey of the apartment.
"What are you up to? Ill-treating the boys, you clovetous avaricious, insatiable old fiend,"
said the man, seating himself deliberately.
"I wonder they don't murder you. I would if I was them. If you'd be yours patient, apprentice, I'd have done it long ago. And no, I couldn't have sold you afterwards, though for you're fit for nothing but keeping a curious of ugliness in the glass bottle. I suppose they don't blow a glass bottle large enough."
"Hush, hush, Mr. Sikes,"
said the Jew, trembling.
"don't speak so loud."
"None of your
miserings,"
replied
the ruffian.
"You always mean mischief when you come that. You know my name. Out with it. I shan't disgrace it with when the time comes."
"Well then, Bill Sikes,"
said the Jew with an abject humility.
"you seem out of humour, Bill."
"Perhaps I am,"
replied Sikes.
"I should think you would rather out of sorts, too, unless you meant a little harm when you throw pewter pots about as you do when you blab. And—"
"Are you mad?" said
the Jew, catching the man by the sleeve and pointing towards the boys.
Mr. Sikes contented himself with tying an imaginary knot under his left ear and jerking his head over his right shoulder, a piece of dumb show which the Jew appeared to understand perfectly, and then, in cant terms, which his whole conversation was plentifully besprinkled with, but would be quite unintelligible if they were recorded here, demanded a glass of liquor.
"And mind you don't poison it,"
said Mr. Sikes, laying his hat upon the table. This was said in jest, but if the speaker could have seen the evil leer with which the Jew bit his pale lip, and turned around to the cupboard, he might have thought that the caution was not wholly unnecessary, or the wish, at all events, to improve upon the distiller's ingenuity, not very far from the old gentleman's merry heart.
After swallowing 2 or 3 glasses of spirit, Mr. Sikes conditioned to take some notice of the young gentleman, which gracious act led to the conversation in which cause and manner of Oliver's capture was circumstantially detailed, with such alterations of improvements on the truth as to the Dodger appeared most advisable under the circumstances.
"I'm afraid," said
the Jew,
"that he may say something which will get us all in trouble."
"That's very likely,"
returned Sikes with a malicious grin.
"You've blown up upon Fagin."
"I'm afraid, you see,"
added the Jew, speaking as if he had not noticed the interruption, and regarded the others closely as he did so.
"I'm afraid that, if the game is up with us, it might be up with a good many more people, and it would come out rather worse for you than it would for me, my dear."
The man started and turned fiercely round upon the Jew, but the old gentleman's shoulders were shrugged up in his ears, and his eyes were vacantly staring in the opposite wall.
There was a long pause. Every member of the respectable coterie appeared plunged into his own reflections, not excepting the dog, who, by a certain malicious licking of his lips, seemed to be meditating an attack upon the legs of the first gentleman or lady he might encounter in the streets when he went out.
"Somebody must find out what has been done at the office," said
Mr. Sikes,
in a much lower tone he had taken since he came in.
The Jew nodded in assent.
"If he hasn't pitched and is committed, there's no fear till he comes out again,"
said Mr. Sikes.
"And that he must be taken care on. You must get hold of him somehow."
Again the Jew nodded.
Imprudence of the line of action, indeed, was obvious, but unfortunately there was one very strong objection to its being adopted, and it was that the Dodger and Charlie Bates and Fagin and Mr. William Sikes happened one and all to entertain a most violent and deeply rooted antipathic and going near the police office on any grounds or pretext whatever.
How long they might have sat and looked at each other in a state of uncertainty, and not the most pleasant of its kind, is difficult to say. It is not necessary to make any guesses on the subject, however, for a sudden entrance of two young ladies whom Oliver had seen on former occasions caused a fresh flow of conversation.
"The very thing,"
said the Jew.
Bet will go, won't you, my dear?"
"Where?"
inquired the young lady.
"Only just up the office, my dear,"
said the Jew coaxingly.
It is due to the young lady to say that she did not positively affirm that she would not, but she merely expressed an emphatic and earnest desire to do thus if she would. It would a polite and delicate evasion of the request, which shows the young lady to have been possessed of that natural good breeding which cannot bear to be inflicted upon its fellow creatures without pain of direct and pointed refusal.
The Jew's countenance fell, and he turned from this young lady, who was gaily, not to say gorgeously attired in a red gown, green boots, and yellow curled papers, to the other female.
"Nancy, my dear,"
said the Jew in the soothing
"what say
manner.
you?"
That it won't do. It is not use a trying on it, Fagin,"
replied Nancy.
"What do you mean by that?"
said Mr. Sikes, looking up in a surly manner.
"What I say, Bill,"
replied the lady collectedly.
"Why, you're just the very person for it," reasoned Mr. Sikes.
Nobody hereabouts knows anything of you,"
"And I don't want him to neither,"
replied Nancy in the same composed manner.
"I'd rather more not than yes with me, Bill,"
"She'll go, Fagin,"
said Sikes.
"No, she won't, Fagin."
said Nancy.
"Yes, she will, Fagin,"
said Sikes.
And Mr. Sikes was right. By dint of alternate threats, promises, and bribes, the lady in question was ultimately prevailed upon to undertake the commission. She was not, indeed, withheld by the same considerations as her agreeable friends, for having very recently moved into the neighbourhood of Field Lane from the remote but genteel suburb of Ratcliffe, she was not under the same apprehension of being recognised by any of her numerous acquaintances.
Accordingly, with a clean white apron tied over her gown, and her curled papers tucked up under a straw bonnet, both articles of dress being provided from the Jew's inexhaustible stock, Miss Nancy prepared to issue forth on her errand.
"Stop a minute, my dear,"
said the Jew, preceding a little covered basket, producing a little covered basket.
"Carry that in one hand. It looks more respectable, my dear."
"Give her a door key to carry in her other hand, Fagin," said
Sikes.
"It looks real and genuine-like."
Yes, my dear, so it does,"
said the Jew, hanging a large street door key on the forefinger of the young lady's right hand.
"There, very good. Very good indeed, my dear,"
said the Jew, rubbing his hands.
"Oh, my brother, my poor, sweet, dear little brother, my innocent little brother,"
exclaimed Nancy, bursting into tears and wringing the little basket and the street door key in the agony of distress.
"What has become of him? Where have they taken him to? Oh, do have pity, and tell me what's been done with the dear boy, gentlemen. Do, gentlemen, please do, gentlemen."
Having uttered these words in the most lamentable and heartbroken tone, to the immeasurable delight of her hearers, Miss Nancy paused, winked to the company, nodded smiling around, and disappeared.
She's a clever girl, my dear,"
said the Jew, turning round in his young friends and shaking his head gravely, as if in a mute
admonition of them to follow the bright example they had just beheld.
"She's an honour to her sex,"
said Mr. Sikes, filling his glass and smiting the table with an enormous fist.
Here's her health, and wishing they were all like her."
While these and many other accolades were being passed on the accomplishment of Nancy, that young lady made the best of her way to the police office, whither, notwithstanding a little natural timidity. Consequently, upon walking through the streets alone and unprotected, she arrived perfectly safe, and shortly afterwards.
Entering by the back way, she tapped softly with the key at one of the cell doors and listened. There was no sound within, so she coughed and listened again. Still, there was no reply, so she spoke.
"Nolly, dear,"
murmured Nancy in the general voice.
"Nolly."
There was nobody inside but a miserable shoeless criminal who had been taken up for playing the flute, and who the offence against society had been clearly proved. He had been very properly committed by Mr. Fang to the House of Corrections for 1 month, with the appropriate and amusing remark that since he had so much breath to spare, it would be much more wholesomely expanded on the treadmill than in a musical instrument. He had no answer, being occupied in mentally bewailing the loss of his flute, which had been confiscated for the use of the county. So Nancy passed on to the next cell, knocked there.
"Well?"
cried the faint and feeble voice.
"Is there a little boy there?"
inquired Nancy with a preliminary sob.
"No,"
replied the voice.
"God forbid."
This was a vagrant of 65 who was going to prison for not playing the flute, or in other words, for begging in the streets and doing nothing for his livelihood. In the next cell was another man who was going to the same prison for hawking tin saucepans without a licence, thereby doing something for his living in defiance of the Stamp Office.
But as neither of these criminals answered to the name of Oliver, or knew anything about him, Nancy made straight up to the bluff officer in the striped waistcoat, and with the most piteous and wailings and lamentations, rendered more piteous by the prompt and efficient use of the street door key and the little basket, demanded her own dear brother.
"I haven't got him, my dear,"
said the old man.
"Where is he?"
screamed Nancy in a distracted manner.
"Why, the gentleman's got him,"
replied the officer.
"What gentleman? Oh, gracious heavens! What gentleman?"
exclaimed Nancy. In reply to this incoherent questioning, the old man informed the deeply affected sister that Oliver had been taken ill in the office, and discharged in consequence of a witness having proved that the robbery to have been committed by some other boy, not in custody, and that the prosecutor had carried him away in an insensible condition to his own residence, and concerning which all the informant knew was that it was somewhere in Pentonville, he having heard that word mentioned as the directions were given to the coachman.
In a dreadful state of doubt and uncertainty, the agonizing young woman staggered to the gate, and then exchanged her faltering walk for a good, swift, steady run, returned by the most devious and complicated route she could think of to the domicile of the Jew.
Mr. Bill Sikes no sooner heard the account of the expedition delivered than he hastily called up the white dog and put his hat on, and expeditiously departed, without devoting any time to the formality of wishing the company a good morning.
"We must know where he is, my dears. He must be found,"
said the Jew, greatly excited.
"Charlie, do nothing but skulk about till you bring home some news of him. Nancy, my dear, I must have him found. I trust to you, my dear. To you and the artful of everything. Stay,
added the Jew, unlocking the drawer and shaking a hand.
"There's money, my dear. I shall shut up the shop tonight. You'll know where to find me. Don't stop here a minute. Not an instant, my dear."
With these words he pushed them from the room, and carefully double locked and barring the door behind them, drew from its place of concealment the box which he had unintentionally disclosed to Oliver, and then he hastily proceeded to dispose of the watches and jewellery beneath his clothing.
A rap at the door started him in this occupation.
"Who's there?"
he cried in a shrill tone.
"Me,"
replied the voice of the Dodger through the keyhole.
"What now?"
cried the Jew impatiently.
Is he to be kidnapped or to the other Ken? Says Nancy.
Inquired the Dodger.
Yes.
Replied the Jew.
Wherever she lays hands on him, find him out, that's all. I shall know what to do next, never fear.
The boy murmured a reply of intelligence and hurried downstairs after his companions.
He is not peached so far,
said the Jew as he pursed his occupation.
If he means to blab to us among his friends, we may yet stop his mouth. And that is the end of our chapters for today. Join us next time. Until then, stay safe, be excellent, and keep reading. Bye for now.